everybody. It's Mr. Wagstaff. More cool stuff to talk about today. All right, so yesterday we kind of got the intro into Reconstruction. Today, things are going to get pretty crazy, all right? So what happens is tensions between the radical Republicans, because the radical Republicans are a very influential group in the government after the Civil War. Radical Republicans wanted really to punish the South, to fundamentally change everything, and the regular Republicans are kind of just wanting to hug it out. All while the president of the United States is Andrew Johnson, who is a Democrat because he was the vice president under Lincoln, who had gotten assassinated. So the story is going to start getting pretty intense today politically, but let's start out by talking about what the lives were like for the newly freed slaves, which are called freedmen, all right? And again, it's only like a one-generational term because a freedman is somebody that was a slave that was then freed. Because you got to keep in mind, if you're a slave your whole life and all of a sudden you're like, you're free, that's a cataclysmic change, all right? I think it's actually kind of hard for students to understand how difficult of a process it was. And here's why, all right? And it has nothing to do with the reason students struggle to understand this is not actually because of a weakness on the students' part. It's actually because you all have a strength that you will gradually lose as you get older, or most people do, which is your ability to learn new things. The younger you are, your ability to learn and adapt and deal with change are exceptional. As you get older, it gets harder to change and learn new things as you move on. You may not be aware of how much harder it is to deal with change now at your age now than it was when you were in first grade. In first grade, you can just go with whatever, all right? Now, and as you get older, it progresses like that. So this is adults and children and everybody that has been freed, all right? Which sounds great. But all of a sudden, they're in a society, they have no idea how it works. Like, how do you get food? How do I get clothes? How do I do anything? Because the slaves, the vast majority of the slaves in the South, had been used to grow cotton. And that's the only thing that they know, which is important, all right? Because as soon as slavery ends, a lot of slaves moved. They moved and left and went to the North, or they went somewhere else. A lot of slaves stayed. And here's what's crazy. A lot of slaves, all right? I don't want to say 50%. I don't want to say half, but it's near there. It could be a little more, a little less. There's not exact numbers of this. So when I say a lot, I mean, I'm not talking 5-6%. A lot of slaves stayed on their plantations. Like, that's crazy because you're like, but slavery's so evil. Yes, but you're not a slave. So there were a lot of plantation owners, when all their slaves were freed, they went and presented their slaves with the option like, hey, so, and like the military would come down, the United States military would make sure that the plantation owner explained this to his slaves. They're like, all right, so the slaves are free. And a lot of plantation owners made the offer that, hey, if you will choose to stay here and keep doing what you've always been doing, I will provide you with clothes every season and meals 3 times a day and a place to live. Like basically the exact same setup you had in slavery. And a lot of slaves took that. Now, let me be very clear here. That is not saying slavery wasn't that bad, that slaves would choose to keep in the same that it actually says the complete opposite. That the absolute horrificness of slavery wasn't necessarily the work, but it was the fact that you had no choice. That when the slaves became freedmen and they had a choice, a lot of them were like, well, yeah, I don't want to be forced to do it, but if it's my choice and I can quit whenever I want, okay, we'll go with it. Now, if you had, and every plantation owner is a completely different human being and how they treated their slaves. Obviously, the absolutely horrific ones, because there's nothing the slaves could have done. Surely, because there are, just like there's awful people on earth, there's got to be good people on earth. There has to be, that treated their slaves at least like humans. and I would assume maybe they had a better relationship. It's so foreign to me to really comprehend what those conversations like. Like, so I used to own you. Now we're just going to work together. But the thing is the slaves have a skill of growing cotton. All right, and they realize there's a market for cotton. So the vast majority of slaves, some way, shape, or form, will continue growing cotton after slavery ends, whether it's for themselves, whether it's for somebody else. But a lot of the slaves stay in the South and grow cotton because that is the one thing that they know how to do, that they can survive off of that ability to do that. And there's a massive market for it. So as soon as slavery ends, there are people that moved away, but the vast majority of cotton farming slaves will continue to grow cotton. Maybe not the same place as in the same plantation. They may move somewhere else, and we'll talk about in the future some different options they have. But a lot of slaves moved, but a lot of them stayed. It just depends on the individual situation. There's no like mass 80% of the slaves did this, and it was more spread out depending on people's individual circumstances. But what they did do is they did immediately create churches, and they immediately created all black schools. Instantaneously, you're going to see racism. So racism, it's not like it didn't exist. It was just hidden under slavery. So slavery was the priority because that's an institution, a legalized institution of owning people. As soon as that institution gets taken away, racism. It is you're an inferior person, not because you're a slave and therefore a lower social class, but because of the color of your skin, because of your race. All right. You see white people in America try to justify how the slaves are still an inferior people to them by now focusing on their race and not what their social class was, which was a slave. And racism, while it was always prevalent, is just going to skyrocket. All right. So black and white people going to school together isn't going to be a thing. So they immediately created all black schools. So the Freedmen's Bureau gets created by the radical Republicans. All right. So here's what the Freedmen's Bureau is. The Freedmen's Bureau is designed to help freedmen get back on their feet. Not really back on their feet, get on their feet for the first time. They're like, hey, do you need some food? We'll get you some food. Do you need some clothes? All right. Do you need an education? Do you need to understand like how money works? They've never used money before. Do you need to understand how land purchases work, how this happens, how rent works, do you need to understand how these things work? And the Freedmen's Bureau was there to help out the freedmen. This was created by the radical Republicans, all right? Because the radical Republicans are like, hey, the freed slaves are people. Now, today, because you're like, wait a minute. The way Mr. Wax has been saying that the radical Republicans were wild and crazy. By the time period they were. Calling the freed slaves, the freedmen, equal people with everybody else was radical. They're like, what? How could you possibly say that? Like, at the time period. That's how crazy it was. So, in history, we look back and we're like, man, radical Republicans really weren't that radical. They were just acknowledging humans are the same. The Freedmen's Bureau helped out for job training to freed slaves and just to help to get the slaves back on their feet. It also helped out poor white people. Poor white people who had everything destroyed with Sherman's March to the Sea in the South. It'll help them out too. But the problem is in the name, it says Freedmen's. So this is a government agency run by tax dollars designed to help out who? Black people in the South. Guess how the South feels about it? So I was going to show you some pictures of like cartoons and stuff at the time that was against the Freedmen's Bureau. I can't in good conscience show you something that racist. I mean, the caricatures that came out in the 1860s of black people is just, it's horrific. Even in a school setting, I don't want to show them to you. Because it is horrifically racist. Because it is this idea that, the Freedmen's Bureau is just going to give them money and they're going to be, all the black people are going to be lazy and not work and like completely made up concepts of what they thought the Freedmen's Bureau was, and that it was their tax money helping out people that aren't paying taxes. Well, it's because they were slaves. They never had a job. They weren't allowed to have a job. Of course they haven't paid taxes. So the South is adamantly against the Freedmen's Bureau. Well, they're so angry about it, and they're all Democrats. Guess who is their Democrat in office? That's right, Andrew Johnson. The Freedmen's Bureau gets passed, which is literally designed to help the freed slaves get jobs so they can pay taxes, and like get them back on their feet. Andrew Johnson vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau. So this is supposed to be a caricature of Andrew Johnson kicking a bureau, which is like a chest of drawers. It's just a play on words. And then little black people jumping out, which, like, this is incredibly racist today. Yet, at the time, this was not even considered racist. It was just the cartoon. But, so Andrew Johnson vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau. It's like, nope, not going to be a thing on my watch. This is the downfall of Andrew Johnson as far as any type of trying to make him out to be a good guy in U.S. history. He actively fights against letting black people and freedmen move up. Like almost instantaneously, there is this attempt to not allow black people to move up with the veto of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, Congress, they're all Republicans. Just because the president vetoes it doesn't mean it doesn't get put into law. It just means you have to have a 2/3 majority in Congress to override it. That never happens. Like, it's because usually it's half Republican, half Democrat. To having 2/3 to override a president's veto almost never happens. Well, everybody's a Republican in Congress. It happens here. And they override his veto, and they put it into place anyway. All right? Johnson is going to start vetoing everything that is designed to help out black people in the South. Congress, led by the radical Republicans now, who are gaining power because they see this is what they're fighting against, they just override each one of his vetoes. If I'm not mistaken, I'm usually not, I believe there are more veto overrides in Johnson's administration by Congress than every other president in American history. Go Google that for me and tell me if I'm right or wrong on that. I'll be interested because I that's what my brain's telling me, but I didn't think to look that up before I started recording. So if I'm wrong, let me know. All right. So there's a backlash against these new rights. All right. So once the radical Republicans start passing laws that help out black people, all right, the South starts passing these laws. Now, you may have at some point in any type of history class before heard of Jim Crow laws. All right. Jim Crow laws are a set of laws that keep black people as second-class citizens. You are correct. However, all right, there is a difference in Jim Crow laws and what I'm getting ready to talk about, which are called the Black Codes. So the Black Codes, all right, is a set of laws put on black people in the South, literally called the Black Codes. All right, if you're black, here's a separate set of laws that apply to you. Stuff like black people have a curfew. You can't be out after dark if you're black. Vagrancy laws, labor contracts. You had to be employed. If you did not have a job and you were black, they'd go put you in jail until you had a job. Now, let me give you a little insight on this whole trying to put black people in prison thing. All right, in the 1860s. All right. This is messed up. They tried to arrest and put as many black people in prison as they could because of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is what Abraham Lincoln passed that freed the slaves. It says slavery in America is banned. There's no forced servitude. You can't force somebody to do work without payment in the United States. Period. Except, and there's an asterisk. It's not really an asterisk on it, but prisoners can. You can make prisoners go do whatever you want them to do. You can make a prisoner be a slave. That's in the American Constitution. So guess why the South keeps trying to find reasons to arrest the black people and put them in jail? So they can have slaves again. All right. That is like an actual real situation where black people would get arrested in the South for something, for not having a job. They get put in prison. Rich plantation owner pays the prison system to rent them slaves. Look how quickly they figured out a way to keep slavery again. All right. And it's these laws that only apply to black people. All right. That you weren't arrested and had this happen to you if you're a white person. Well, this takes place for about a year. And the radical Republicans in the United States say, nah, South, what are you doing? No. And they're going to pass two big mamma jamma amendments. So the 13th Amendment, super famous, frees the slaves. They're also going to turn around and they're going to pass the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. All right. So this is the 14th Amendment here. I'm going to go back to that last picture here in a second. 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdictions thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Here's what that means. Hey, were you born here? You're an American citizen. Period. There's no 1A, 1B citizenship. There's no ranking of citizens. If you're born here, you're a citizen. Period. Guess who just got citizenship? Black people. The freedmen. There's no separate set of laws because all laws have to apply to all citizens the same. The black codes, you can't make different laws for different citizens. So the 14th Amendment makes everybody a citizen. This is big because keep in mind, throughout the 1800s when they're like, yeah, let's get rid of slavery. And there's this like back to Africa movement. Like, well, what are you going to do with all the slaves? Like, oh, we'll figure it out when we get there. Well, what they ended up doing, make them citizens. Nobody, or very few people in the early 1800s thought about making slaves full citizens shortly after the Civil War, but the radical Republicans did. Then, with the 14th Amendment, they're like, here's the hammer. The 15th Amendment. Black people can vote. When you give black people the right to vote, that is the weapon you have in a democracy. All these freedmen can now vote. 4 million votes in the South that clearly aren't going to support the white supremacy concept that is taking place in the South. All right. Women still don't have the right to vote. All right. So this does still exclude women, black women, white women as well. But the 15th Amendment gives all male citizens in the United States at the time, age 21 and over, the right to vote. This is huge. All right. Because how do you keep bullcrap laws from being passed? Just don't have people vote for it. All right. So the radical Republicans, when they pass the 15th Amendment, they're like, done. Like, this is like a perpetual motion machine. Like, in no way can black people be treated inferiorly, treated badly, now that they have the right to vote, because nobody is going to pass laws against them because they can't, because black people have the right to vote. What radical Republicans are going to fail to realize, and we're going to see this for the next 100 years, is there's this huge movement in the South to try to prevent black people from voting. But let me go back to this other picture here. This here, Mr. Stevens, he is kind of the face of the radical Republicans at the time. So the Reconstruction Act the radical Republicans did and kind of forced through after President Johnson's is that the state governments you have to restart your whole government, rewrite your constitutions. We're not doing that again. You're not coming back in with constitutions that have racist language. You have to accept the 14th Amendment. You have to come back in. Only have to accept the 13th that slavery's over. The 14th and 15th that slavery or that slaves are now citizens or freedmen are now citizens and they have the right to vote. Accept that. And and then African American men must be allowed to vote. So the Reconstruction plan by the radical Republicans, extremely aggressive in trying to help out African Americans. So the first election, there's a lot of people who would show up to vote. So when black people got the right to vote, they understood in the first elections for black people, they didn't know how to read or write. So how are you going to read a ballot? Well, so what they would do is the whoever's running would like show up at like town hall or wherever, like the two guys, and they stand on opposite sides. And when you showed up to vote, they'd be given like a pebble or a colored rock of some sort, and they'd go over to whichever guy they want, and they'd drop a rock into the little jar. That was their vote. And then at the end of the day, whoever had the most rocks wins. That's how they did voting very early on, very primitively, because there was no that they knew that African Americans or the freedmen at the time didn't have the ability to read and write. All right, this here is all right. Andrew Johnson, the Democrat president, is getting ready to get impeached. Now, impeached does not mean you're kicked out of office. Does not mean well, we've had a few presidents that have been impeached throughout American history. Most of them are relatively recently. The very first president to ever be impeached is Andrew Johnson. All that means is that you are being charged with a crime. If you are convicted, all right, then you are kicked out of office. So there have been 3 at the time of this recording. There have been 3 presidents that have been impeached. All right, Andrew Johnson we're getting ready to talk about. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton was impeached, and then between 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump was impeached. All 3 of them were found not guilty. Now, let me tell you the story because it's very similar in the 3 on why they are found not guilty. We'll ignore the Donald Trump one and the Bill Clinton one. Let's just talk about Andrew Johnson. So the radical Republicans hate Andrew Johnson. And Republicans in Congress in general just cannot stand Andrew Johnson. All right? The only way to get rid of him is if he breaks a law, you can convict him and then kick him out of office. However, Andrew Johnson's not stupid. He's stubborn, but he's not stupid. All right? He's not going to break any law. So the radical Republicans set a trap for him. Now, it is the clearest, it is the most stubborn entire situation that happens here. Congress passes a law which is bullcrap. It is a law, and the law is called the Tenure of Office Act. All right? The Tenure of Office Act gets passed by the radical Republicans in Congress. It is bait for Andrew Johnson. Here's what the Tenure of Office Act says. You can't fire your cabinet members. So your cabinet members are appointed by the president. They're basically like your advisors. Well, Andrew Johnson didn't appoint all the cabinet members. Lincoln had. So all the cabinet members are mainly Republicans, right? And Andrew Johnson doesn't really like them. He wants to appoint his own cabinet members. So he's probably going to fire them and replace them with Democrats. Congress knows he's going to do this. So they set a trap for him. It's like, you can't fire those Republicans, which is ridiculous. Like, sure you can. They're your advisors. Well, Andrew Johnson's like, that law's stupid. And they're like, well, it's the law. And so the Republicans passed it. And Andrew Johnson's like, he like shows up the next day at work. He's like, oh, I can't fire him? All right, Billy, fired. Like he fires like the first guy he can see on his cabinet that's a Republican and fires him. All right. Because he disagrees with this new law. However, technically, did Andrew Johnson just break a law? Yes, Andrew Johnson has fallen into this trap that the radical Republicans set for him. Now that he has broken this law by firing one of his advisors, he gets impeached, which means he gets put on trial in front of the Senate, and they determine whether or not to kick him out of office. They have him right where they want him, all right? And all they have to do is vote to kick him out of office. Here's what ends up happening in this impeachment. This is a little graph here. He is found not guilty. So you have the little blocks here, all right? And they're both exactly the same in the votes. He was charged for 2 different things. You need 36 votes for him to be guilty and kicked out, because it has to be a vast majority, all right? You needed 36 votes to have him convicted. Only 39 found him guilty. Now, all these people said he's not guilty. And you're like, he clearly did it. Like, what? Clearly, 100% he did this, all right? Well, he he did do it. But here's what the logic is. Well, they get him right where they want to, and they're going to kick him out. The South is just staring at him like, you going to kick our boy out? People realize a lot of these are radical Republicans. A lot of the other Republicans, obviously the Democrats, they're like, man, if we kick him out, you know what's going to happen the next time that there's a Republican president? The Democrats are just going to find a way to impeach him on, like, it's going to be a tit for tat thing. Like, yeah, he broke the rules, but is this really like something we're going to start this precedent now? Is this really a thing that we want to start doing, a road that we want to go down? And kind of at the last minute, enough people are like, man, I don't want to do this. We clearly set a trap for him. We're going to kick a president out of office. Never been done before. We're at a pivotal stage of, the history of America. Do we really want to throw this monkey wrench in the engine right now? And because of that thought, they said, he's not guilty. And he is found not guilty. Now, he only has a couple months left in office, all right? And he's going to try to run for re-election, and it ain't going to be good. He has no chance of winning. But basically, the last few months, he kind of just sits down and shuts up and stares at the corner. Like, there's nothing he can really do because he's lost, like, his mandate, his support of the American people after this. But he is the first president to be impeached, and he is acquitted. We've had 3 presidents that have been impeached, and all 3 have been acquitted, and it has gone real close to this exact same story for all 3 of them. So now that he is impeached and he finishes his term, who's going to show up and take over? That's what we're going to start talking about tomorrow, because you know who's going to take over? A war general. Mr. Wagstaff, are you saying that William Tecumseh Sherman's getting ready to be the president? I didn't say that. I said a war hero. But I don't know. You have to tune in tomorrow and find out who becomes the next president. See y'all tomorrow.